Welcome to today's podcast. Now, if you drive through Heacham in northwest Norfolk, beside the main road, you'll see a magnificent village sign which shows a crab-clawed seahorse on one side and a horse on the other. Now, between the two, looking out straight at you, is a woman in 17th century costume. Perhaps surprisingly, this is Pocahontas, a Native American woman, a tragic spirit of honour and hope, who crossed cultural divides and whose story has inspired artists, writers and filmmakers across the centuries. She has a very special connection to Norfolk, as we shall discover shortly. Because with me today is Chris Wood, curator of the Icony collection and something of an expert on Pocahontas and her magical significance in particular.
Hello.
Hello. Now, yesterday, the 21st of March, was the 404th anniversary of her death. And you may have seen Chris's posts on Facebook and Instagram to honour the occasion. But first of all, I'd like to ask you, Chris, about the beginnings of Pocahontas' story, which is perhaps the most famous part of it.
Okay, well, Pocahontas was a young girl living in what's now called Virginia. And one day in 1607, 3 ships came sailing up the Powhatan River, which the occupants of those ships renamed the James River, and they came ashore and they started building a stockade. That stockade eventually became Jamestown, which was the first sustained English settlement in North America. It wasn't long before the English made contact with the local people, who also called themselves the Powhatan, of the Algonquian group of peoples. One day, someone called John Smith was exploring up one of the other rivers when he was taken captive by some of the people from the Powhatan tribe. And he was brought before their high chief, if you like. And that's when the story gets confused, because John Smith himself claims that he was to be put to death. And suddenly, just as a club was about to be brought down on his head, a young girl, Pocahontas, flung herself over him to stop him being harmed. According to John Smith, he was then taken off, and later another ceremony took place. Now, John Smith is noted for embellishing things, shall we say, and there are a couple of other occasions in his writings where he describes being rescued by well-born ladies during his mercenary time in Eastern Europe. The fact that he doesn't actually mention this rescue until 1624, when most other people involved were either dead or definitely in what was considered the enemy camp, maybe does suggest that he might have perhaps made one or two bits up.
I think you did say as well that at the time, Pocahontas would have been very young indeed.
Yes, 10 or 12. And the chances of a young girl like that being allowed in at an execution or any kind of ceremony, positive or negative, was pretty slim, according to sources we have that have researched the indigenous traditions, whether those are native peoples or outside academics. So it seemed very unlikely that what he describes actually took place. Pocahontas did meet John Smith, with no doubt about that. She often came at the head of groups of people carrying supplies for the poor starving English settlers in Jamestown, and they had her at the head. Now, this is was said to be because she was disobeying her father and bringing these supplies to Jamestown. Actually, the truth is more likely to be that her father had taken pity on the English and was sending supplies carried by adults, but to show that they came in peace, they put a child in front, because who were going to raid an unarmed child leading the group? So that Pocahontas turned up at Jamestown, played with the kids there as well, but wasn't leading the group. She was the token of peace.
Some of the stories suggest that she married John Smith, but that wasn't actually the case, was it?
No, and to be perfectly frank, there's no hint of any kind of love interest in the more contemporaneous writings. And had there been, it would have made John Smith a paedophile. And whatever the good and bad points about John Smith, that wasn't one of them.
But in fact, Pocahontas did come to marry an English person, didn't she?
She did, although the story is a bit longer than that, because over time she grew up, she became an adult, and she went off and married another indigenous person, Cauldron. But there was an English ship captain called Argyle who happened upon her and the village she was living in, realised who she was, and not quite sure how this happened, bribed or in some other way got the people in charge of that village to get Pocahontas to come on board his ship, where he basically took her hostage and took her back to Jamestown. She was held hostage, but when we think about hostage, we're not thinking about sort of terrorist hostages in the modern world. Hostage exchange was a normal thing in Europe and amongst the peoples of North America. And Pocahontas would have been used to the idea that sometimes, whether you like it or not, people get taken off and assimilated with another tribe. It certainly appeared that she accepted that as her lot, and she converted to Christianity, although she was probably taking on the religion of her adoptive society rather than rejecting her own faith and the faith of her land. Indeed, a number of other Powhatan people came to stay with her over time. They didn't convert. So it seems that she was adopting her new society's norm.
So almost out of politeness, really.
In a way, yes. Just as, had she gone to live with a different Algonquian tribe, for instance, she would have adopted their customs and honoured their deities.
Of course, a really interesting point is how she came to travel to England. Would you like to tell us the story behind that remarkable journey?
Well, that is partly also the remaining answer to your first question, because she moved out was taken out of Jamestown a bit further upstream to a new settlement called Henrico, where she was indoctrinated in Christianity. And she also met another settler by the name of John Rolfe. He came a bit later, 1610, and in fact, his story is quite tragic because he was crossing the Atlantic in a convoy of ships with his pregnant wife. Her name is not recorded. They were shipwrecked on Bermuda, and it sounds all very nice, thinking what one thinks of Bermuda today, but actually it was quite hard for them, and she gave birth on Bermuda, and the child was named Bermuda. Unfortunately, the child only lived a few days. Eventually, the shipwrecked people managed to use wreckage from the ship they were on and tree trunks and so on, and managed to build two smaller ships and got to Jamestown. Sadly, Mrs. Rolfe died not long after. But John Rolfe, who was very interested in the possibilities for various crops, in particular the cash crop of tobacco, took a shine to this young lady who had been called Pocahontas, but when she adopted Christianity, had been given a new name, Rebecca, a Christian name, Rebecca. which has significance when one thinks about the Rebecca of the Bible. Cut a long story short, implies the red-skinned people serving the white-skinned people. But in any case, it seems that Rebecca and John Rolfe genuinely had affection for each other. And whilst it was quite common, it seems, for the settlers to cohabit with native women, it was tacitly approved because most of the settlers were men. It was relatively late that women started going over. But to actually marry one of them was something which socially was still considered rather taboo. Anyway, John Rolfe proposed to her and they married. And because of his interest in this wonderful cash crop tobacco, the fact that Pocahontas, or Rebecca, was able to provide access to some of the knowledge of how to grow tobacco, this enterprise took off, and the Virginia Company, who was financing and organising the settlement, they wanted to show off the successes, sweeping over the things that went wrong, of course, but show off the successes of the venture in London. So they organised for John Rolfe, Rebecca, Pocahontas, and 10 or 11 other Powhatans to come across to London so that the Virginia Company could try to get more financial backers. So that's how they came to be here.
It's quite remarkable to think of them all being here, and London in the 17th century must have been quite a shock to the system of these people who'd lived such a rural existence. Are there any records of what Pocahontas and her fellow travellers actually thought about the capital city of England at the time?
Well, we have very little of what she or her compatriots actually thought. One of the best bits we have was actually when she finally encountered John Smith. He'd left in 1609, he'd left Virginia, he'd come back. The stories vary. He might have been badly wounded, but he was also fed up with the way things were going. In fact, if you're badly wounded, you probably wouldn't set off on a voyage across the Atlantic in the 17th century. You might well die en route, but that's another story. He eventually comes to see her, and she tears him off a strip for being unfaithful and basically going back on his word to her father. We know this because John Smith recorded it, and given the embellishments he usually makes, the fact that she's taking him so much to task does lend some credibility. She was probably even stronger in her words, I suspect.
But maybe he made it look a bit better for himself than it really was.
Indeed, but yeah, it was negative enough. So okay, if it's John Smith writing this down, that probably happened. But we've got very little about what they actually said and thought, because people talked to them certainly, and but then when things were written up by the English people who talked to them rather than, and not in their own voices. But certainly the Powhatans were used to a rather more hygienic lifestyle than 17th century London could afford. They'd bathe in clean rivers every day. You wouldn't want to do that in the Thames in the 17th century.
Definitely not. How long did they actually stay in London? Was it weeks or months?
Months. The exact date they arrived, I couldn't rightly say, but they stayed for most of 1616, and indeed they were preparing to leave. Well, they set sail in March 1617, although at the time it would have been recorded as 1616 because the year changed in late March. Which is why the one portrait of Pocahontas from life, an engraving by Van der Pas, actually says on it 1616, although it was actually the portrait was taken in January or February 1617, but because it was considered 1616 at the time, that's the way it is on the engraving. that's just to avoid the confusion that sometimes arrives. But that engraving also tells us something else. It says in Latin that it was done in the 21st year of her life.
So she was still very young when she came to London.
She was very young. She's already a mother. She had borne a child to John Rolfe, and when that portrait was taken, she was in her 21st year. So the probability is by the time she died, she was not yet 21.
Before we come on to the tragedy of her death, can you tell us a bit about her connection to Norfolk?
Okay, well, the big connection, almost certainly, is that John Rolfe came from Heacham. There is a Rolfe family in Heacham, and local tradition has it that that is indeed the scion of the Rolfe family, and we're 99% sure that he did come from that Rolfe family. And naturally, if you've been away for years, you got married, got a child overseas, you come back, you're going to visit your family. And therefore, if that's John Rolfe from Heacham, the chances of him not going back home with his wife and child are pretty slim. And indeed, the local tradition has it that indeed Pocahontas did visit.
Yes, I think anybody in Heacham would be most upset if you suggested that there was any doubt as to whether she went there.
Well, we just don't know for sure because the Rolfe family records don't seem to go back in any great detail that far. The famous Heacham Hall, which the RAF managed to burn down during the Second World War, wasn't there then either. There's a story which probably has less credibility that Pocahontas planted a tree. Well, maybe she did, but there are a mulberry tree. In fact, there are a lot of mulberry trees being planted at the time to benefit the silk industry, which was one of James I's initiatives. And there's a 17th century mulberry tree that's supposed to be the one. There's a stump of another that is supposed to be the one, but whether she did or not.
Do you think that if you eat the fruit of that mulberry tree, it would help you contact better with her story? If you ate the fruit from the tree that she actually planted all of those years ago?
Well, I suspect that she didn't actually plant it herself. So I think the connection would indeed be with the story rather than her. But the story is an interesting, and going back to the Norfolk link, a number of other people in her actual story were from Norfolk. John Smith, although he was born in Lincolnshire, was apprenticed in King's Lynn. There's a lad called Henry Spellman who, according to John Smith, was rescued from captivity by Pocahontas. He was a hostage with the Powhatans, learning to be a translator. He, in his writings later, says that he got away of his own accord. He didn't need the help of a young girl. He came from Norfolk as well, and he came from Hunstanton, in fact. The clergyman who married John Rolfe and Pocahontas came from Windham in Norfolk. And of course, there's a city in Virginia today called Norfolk. So there are some connections between this county and the actual story of Pocahontas.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And most of them, apart from the clergyman from Windham, most of those people involved are from northwest Norfolk because, for those people who don't know the area, King's Lynn and Hunstanton are very, very close to Heacham, aren't they?
They are indeed, yes. But there's another thing which, in terms of story, seems to connect Norfolk with the whole Virginia situation, because quite a while previously, there was a woman who took a stand against an occupying force. Her name was Boudicca, and she came from Norfolk, of course. The Roman occupation was in some ways quite similar to the English settlement or the European settlement in North America. And there were those, even in the 17th century, who likened what we were doing with the Roman civilization of the barbarians. And the poor benighted natives, whether that was in Norfolk in 60-61 CE when Boudicca's revolt happened, or whether was in Virginia, those poor benighted natives were going to get the benefit of civilization from the Romans, or later from the English, and with it, of course, Christianity.
But in fact, all Pocahontas got was disease and death from being here, of course, because of the unhygienic conditions. So perhaps you'd like to explain a little bit about her tragic end.
Yes, well, she and her compatriots didn't like living in central London, and fairly quickly it was arranged for them to stay out at Brentford, which is upstream on the Thames. It was in the countryside then, and that was where John Smith finally came to visit her, in fact. So yes, they were deliberately taken to somewhere that was a bit more wholesome than central London, whilst they were obviously taken to and from engagements at the Royal Court and theatre and so on and so forth. But we're not clear how early in her visit Pocahontas actually began to take ill. It does seem that a number of her entourage sickened. A couple may have died, but certainly she was taken very ill on board ship, such that the ship was actually halted at Gravesend, so not very far downstream from London, Gravesend in Kent, for her to be taken off to seek medical attention. Unfortunately, that medical attention was unsuccessful and she died and was buried very, very quickly on the 21st of March in Gravesend, in the church, St George's Church, under the nave. Now, and that was probably less of a job in the 17th century than it would be today, but even so, that suggests a bit of clout on the part of John Rolfe to have her buried in the church itself. One could imagine that a rapid burial was considered essential because her illness was probably contagious. Certainly other people on board ship were also ill with something similar. We don't know exactly where she's buried. The church itself has burnt down twice in the intervening centuries, and various excavations have not proved where she might have been buried. Of course, she left a young son, and John Rolfe presumably was worried he was going to lose a second family, and when the ship docked at Plymouth, he had the child taken in secure hands back to his family to be brought up.
So he might well have been brought up in Heacham then?
He probably was, yes. And certainly Thomas wanted to see his father, but by the time he actually got to Virginia, John Rolfe was already dead.
You've made an interesting connection a little while ago between Boudicca and Pocahontas. Both of them who have really become symbols of people standing up to oppression. But what more would you say about her legacy for us today? Both in a wider cultural perspective and also from a magical point of view.
She certainly was a bridge between the communities. And this is something that Gareth Knight says when he talks about Pocahontas. And in fact, it was my first introduction to her as if you like, a magical figure. That was some 10 years before I realised the significance of the dates. In 2016, when I was actually asked to introduce the pagan song at the Norwich Interfaith celebration that year, which had been proposed to be Colours of the Wind, which, as those who are total Disney refusers will know, is one of the best known songs from the Disney film Pocahontas. It's quite contrived and very general, but actually, when you think about the words in it, it's not a bad introduction to a more land-conscious spirituality. But the thing was that I suddenly realised that it was 400 years ago that Pocahontas was in England, and indeed visiting Norfolk. That's when my research has really got going. Her story, immediate story, if you like, was that there was a piece of Pocahontas which lasted until 5 years after she died. There was a big rebellion in Virginia, 5 years almost to the day of her death. Now, the exact reason for that timing, no one really knows, but that does seem interesting, and also because it's close to the spring equinox. Didn't go terribly well for the indigenous peoples overall, and the rest, as they say, is history. There is very little of the Powhatan tribe left today. The remnants became part of another tribal grouping, and anyone knows the history of colonisation in North America. First Nations are only in recent times been able to reclaim something. Her story, or the propaganda, shall we say, was twisted even during her lifetime. The way that she was brought over and paraded for the benefit of the Virginia Company. Clearly, any illusion she might have had about the intentions of the Virginia Company, in a positive sense, must have been shattered fairly early on. John Smith wrote about her afterwards, and his final writings on the subject were published in 1624, which is when he comes out with this big story about the fantastic rescue. That, as I mentioned earlier, seems to fit in with his stories of being rescued by highborn ladies elsewhere, but also there were some Spanish narratives that seemed to fit it in North America. That story got used and abused. It got used by the South when there was the split between North and South in the United States of America, where a lot of people claimed descent from Pocahontas. Well, Thomas, this is, because when he did go to Virginia, he settled and married and had offspring. The North, in the Civil War dispute, used the story to criticise the South, because saying, hang on a minute, you guys have got slaves, you have racial distinction, but you're claiming you're descended from a princess of, the native people. How does that work then, you hypocrites?
Well, of course, people use stories in all sorts of different ways to, as you say, to bolster their own propaganda, don't they?
They do indeed. But there's been this unfortunate aspect of the Pocahontas story that developed somewhat later, more or less this beginning of the 19th century, this literary tradition of Pocahontas and John Smith having a love affair, which means her age gets skated over, necessarily, for that to work. Even that, there was a very beautiful film called The New World in 2005 by Terrence Malick, and even that has the love affair in it. And interestingly, Pocahontas was played by Corianka Kilcher. At the time, she was only 14, which perhaps perhaps makes for an uncomfortable comparison of 21st and 17th century ideas of maturity. At 14, Pocahontas herself would have been considered a woman, certainly, as opposed to a child. Though when John Smith actually met her, she was a lot younger than that.
So, if you had to sum up, just as a conclusion, what Pocahontas means to you magically, and why you've spent so much time researching her story and thinking about it, and working magically with her spirit, if you like.
Well, as Gareth Knight said, she was a bridge between communities. There was a piece of Pocahontas. Now, whether the overall history of European colonisation of North America would have been any different, it has to be in doubt. But for a time, there was an accommodation between the two cultures. Her death put pay to that. Her story, used and abused as it has been, at best, has become an inspiration for hope. She herself, the real Pocahontas, she didn't just acquiesce to her situation, she accepted the lot she'd been given and lived her life with honour, to do the best for her family and for her peoples, both of them. She was a bridge, and one of her other names, Pocahontas, in fact, was a nickname, meaning little mischief. And she had other names associated with her. And it's unclear which of them might have been her secret birth name, which of them was a use name, which was the name she actually took on entering adulthood. But those two names being Amanute and Matoaka. And whilst we're not 100% sure what Amanute means, Matoaka seems to mean either one who sparks, kindles, one who flowers, but between two streams. So it's like she's like a magical creative spark between two polar forces of the indigenous people and the English settlers. And she has inspired characters who fit in with the noble savage motif. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of that term, noble savage, but at best it means someone who is of greater connection to the natural world, to the land, who actually shows the so-called civilized world that there's a better way. And Rebecca the Jew in Ivanhoe seems to be modelled to some extent after Rebecca Rolfe. In the story of Wonder Woman, there seems to be an influence as well, in that you've got a young woman who defies the ruler, her mother, to help a young man that turns up in a woman-only world, not like the classical Diana perhaps, and then goes to help in man's world. And the film Avatar, very clearly predicated on the Pocahontas story in part, where you've got Neytiri that helps the rebellious Earthman to actually save her people.
So her story goes on and on.
Her story goes on and on. It's one of hope as well as one of tragedy.
Well, thank you very much. And perhaps just before we finish, you'd like to mention the places where people can look for your articles about Pocahontas and for some of the pictures that you've posted about her as well.
Well, certainly, if you go on to www.ickeney, that's ickeny.co.uk, there is a page about Pocahontas and some of the objects in the collection that are to do with her story. There's an Instagram page at Ickeney Collection and a Facebook page as well. Come and have a look.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.